So I'm going to pass it over to Latoya Reid.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for providing the opportunity for me to not only share my experience with you all, but also be a part of this transformative approach in creating a more egalitarian society. So my name is Latoya Reid. I'm an immigrant here in Canada. Originally, my genetics, my genes are rooted in an African descent, and I lost the connections of who I am due to the slave trade, transported to the Caribbean where I grew up. The life that I know is as a Jamaican. And then I transitioned here to Canada, where I have also amalgamated and started a new life in and of itself. And so I identify as a Black individual, and I also am a trained, registered social worker who works right now as a psychotherapist. And one of my role as a psychotherapist is rooted not only in being a decolonizing therapist, but also rooted in supporting individuals with race-based trauma. So over the past year and a half or so, initially my clientele would have represented mainly Blacks who were making meaning of their experiences, especially as it related to the unrest, the civil unrest that surrounded the George Floyd phenomenon. And then slowly it transitioned. I think if I could pedal back, I worked as a medical social worker, as a health educator in healthcare. So a lot of my support with psychotherapy also started with the Indigenous society. So many of my clients were also Indigenous, and I got to have a bird's eye view in the specific challenges that are associated with individuals who have either had trauma, intergenerational, or have had trauma stemmed to systemic oppression. And then as the unrest and oppression in society transitioned, I started seeing a lot more persons of color. And when I say that, I mean Asian society. We're all aware of what's happening with the anti-Asian rhetorics that are happening in society. So that has been causing a lot of unrest. But today I want to speak about benevolence clothed in racism. And the reason I want to speak about that is I remember 6 years ago when I immigrated to Canada, the Open Door Society was a haven for me, was a safe haven for me. It was an organization that became quite resourceful. And I remember that they connected me with a young lady who became my friend, and she identifies as white. And one of her role for me was to provide support that I thought was charitable. So she would help me to source items for my home and stuff like that. And then over time, I believe that we developed a friendship. And I don't think my belief was unreasonable, because this was an individual that I grew affectionate with. This was an individual who was becoming known to my family. But the more I assimilated what our relationship meant, I recognized that while I was inviting this person in my home, while I was trying to break down barriers with this person, a lot of boundaries were still established. So while this person was invited to family settings, were introduced to my inner circle groups, I was never one to be invited to any circles. And then I saw that it was more of me being a charity case where secondhand stuff from her friends or whoever would have been passed down to me. And when I made meaning of that, I recognized that my relationship with this individual was very, very restricted. I was always going to be seen in one light, and she would always, there was a distance in our relationship. It doesn't matter how I tried to forge or break that barrier. And so I still love that individual, but last year, my consultation with that individual when I was going through my own struggles with the race-based trauma that surrounded me was to for her to ask, how can I be of support to you? And one of the ways that I asked for her to be of support to me was to use her privilege, her white privilege, her space to provide education to the people within her circle, because I thought that there could be a wave effect, a ripple effect, where one person teaches another, and that barrier where Blacks and the skin that we're in gets erected as threats, and instead it becomes we're humanized and people can see us for the value that we brought. So instantly, when I confronted my friend and asked her for that, I say, can we go to the Black Lives Matter rally together? We can just dress almost as twins, and we can show people that Black and white can coexist. My friend could not provide that support. And that was when I recognized that her role was really a role of benevolence. And while I recognized that her intentions were probably pure, it was also laden in ideologies, stereotypes that were aligned with racism. So hopefully I can get my slide to work. Okay, my son helped me with this, everyone. So I want to start with providing the historical context that social work is linked intricately to the idea of charity. So social work and philanthropy are some of the grounding elements that started social justice. And the aim at that time was to eradicate poverty and address inequality. And one of the ways that that could have been actualized at that time was through Christian churches, Christian organization, and community services. And through that, we saw historically poorhouses, home for the elderly, shelters, schools, and so forth that are still available today being established. But as the industrial age era transition, what we saw was a transition from charity work through the church being now overseen by social welfare services that we now know them as. So what's the true purpose of philanthropy? Philanthropy, in my opinion, is aimed at empowering, supporting, defending the disadvantaged individuals and groups in society, and also mainly to challenge racial inequity with policies and sustainable, tangible actions. So I guess the main question is, can good intentions cause damage? In my opinion, it can. Historically, we have seen that it does happen. And even with Dr. McCormack's speech, where he spoke about the discovery of the 215 tombs for Indigenous children, I think if we spoke to the Catholic Church, they would have said that, thought that they were doing good. But today we are seeing, and historically, we have seen the damaging impact of people who think that they are doing good. And the reason doing good sometimes can seem and have damaging impact is because then and even today, the focus of philanthropy has always been on focusing on alleviating rather than eliminating root causes. Also, it often is rooted in paternalism rather than empowerment, so that fiduciary power is imposed on individuals, and for some reason, that those individuals who assume that fiduciary power are always those who embody a white system. So how does benevolence become damaging? It is really through assumptions and actions, as I said before, that would erect one as making decisions in the best interest of others. And in reality, if I am the true individual who know myself in the best way, how can someone know what is best for me? So how is one able to make decisions on my behalf when instead the assumption should be one where or input is sought or leadership is valued, and opportunity is presented to anyone who wants to occupy the space of philanthropy or the space of charity by providing themselves with the humility to be corrected and to really have those corrections actualized. So, as I said before, a fiduciary ideology and paternalistic ideologies and policies are laden in decision making, where people think that they're making decisions on our behalf and or in our best interest. And oftentimes what happens is those decisions are laden in no racist notions that often erect us as undeveloped or lacking the ability to make decisions in our own best interests. So Tabani, in her book, The Exalted Subjects, speaks about the dichotomic divide that runs within the Canadian nation. And that is one where whiteness is situated as civilized and is a standard for measurement among racialized groups or non-white groups. And inadvertently, what happens, whether it's inadvertently or intentionally, what happens is non-white groups are then relegated to stereotypical identities as being subhumans. So how is this damage continuing to perpetuate? It perpetuates when philanthropic groups forget or ignore that culture should be a big factor in their planning, where they regard all groups as homogeneous rather than individualize each group. So oftentimes I will speak to individuals and I will say to them, yes, you see a group of Black people, but you never individualize Blacks. And my research, my thesis that I recently did on Latin Americans who are making their way to the US border speaks of some approaches that are being used to perpetuate this kind of notion. So there's the use of collectivism, where groups are seen as one group, so the diversity within that group isn't honored or isn't recognized. The aggregation, we're seen as numbers, the pathologization, and we could go on and on and on. But instead, within, and I can speak for the Black community, within the Black community, yes, we're all rooted from Africa, but within that is the diversity that you have biracial Blacks, you have Caribbean Blacks, you have African Blacks. And yes, we're all Africans, but our diversity within our group needs to be honored in order to meet our specific needs, because my trauma associated with even, let's say, the slave trade is different from Africans. When you look at Africans, the trauma that they suffered due to their families being taken from them would be almost akin to the indigenous, where their children were taken from them through the residential schools and they never got the opportunity to see them. Many of our ancestors never made it through the middle passage. They died on the way. So yes, you see the end product, but within that middle passage, so many of our ancestors never made it. So that trauma is a trauma of loss. But on the other end, especially for me, I know that that loss for me is a loss where I can never know my culture. I never know who I am. I have to go searching. Am I Nigerian descent? Am I Ghanaian descent? Am I from the Ivory Coast? Where exactly am I from? And the name that I wear, what am I, is it something that I can assume? And when I worked in social services, that was some of the trauma and the struggle that Indigenous children that I supported had to suffer through. They could not identify their culture, they were losing their language, and that is something that needs to be preserved within any philanthropic group that needs to support us. Another big issue is color blindness and neutrality. That is one that irks me a lot. I remember sharing with one of my coworkers what was happening, and her response last year, and her response to me was, oh, I don't know what this how this happens. You know, for me, I don't see color. And instantly it was like a dagger in my heart, because I'm like, okay, if you don't see color, what do you see then? Why would one need to disconnect from the reality that we're all different, We all have skin color. And the fact that I'm a Black woman means that my experiences of navigating this world are very, very different, are even way challenging than one who is white and has privilege. So why can't we see color and use that color recognition to recognize that our experiences are going to be different when it ought not to be, and then use this recognition as the impetus to get us to a place where we start making and having tangible discussions and policy changes about making this place a place that honors and values our diversity rather than one that invalidates, denies, and justify racial social systems that support white privilege, where one will say, no, I don't see color. So if you don't see color, it means that in wanting you to acknowledge and honor me as a Black woman is going to be dismissive, because if you don't see my Blackness, then that means you picture me as someone who is white. And that is something that people of color tend to resent. So what does benevolence clothed in racism look like? It is really a way that further legitimizes and reinforces racist attitudes, policies, and practices in the name of benevolent aims. So lots of foundations will start by saying, I'm supporting this, I'm empowering, my role is to defend. But in defending and supporting and empowering, they still have policies that are contrary to that aim. So really, benevolence in racism first emphasizes racial accommodation rather than challenge the status quo and evoke transformational change. It really adopts practices that align to functionality, where discriminatory practices and policies are condoned as necessary evils with the intent of creating a greater good in due time for the Black community and society at large. And when I say the Black community, I think this point, most of the points that I will make today can be applied to Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color. Another way that racism within benevolence manifests is by discrediting policies that are designed to correct structural racial inequities. And oftentimes, in discrediting that, people will say, oh, that's unfair, it's unjustified, it's counterproductive. And ultimately, they will say, oh, these choices that these people are trying to implement tend to be more detrimental to their needs. So if we speak about this new drive to defund the police, that is exactly what some of the rhetoric have been. It's unfair to defund the police. It's unjustified. It's counterproductive. Who's going to protect us? But why would we need to be protected when, on the other side, we can look for the root causes that problematize certain groups of people, and then use some of the funding that are directed in a reactive approach, and then treat the root causes where we won't need so much emphasis on law enforcement, because people are healing, people are reconciling, people are improving in and of themselves. So we won't have broken people living in a broken system, where the system creates this brokenness and perpetuates this brokenness. And instead, true funding is being directed where it cannot necessarily alleviate the problem, but help to treat the root causes, which a lot of it is really in a system of racism and structural oppression. So what then are the solutions to the benevolence clothed in racism? This list for sure is not exhaustive, but I thought that these were a few salient points that I thought would be helpful. So the first is to consult. And consultation means wide-scale diversity. Seek out the responses, the needs. Oftentimes when we're doing research, we talk about needs assessment. So needs assessment really means that you don't just sit in your circle and be comfortable and decide paternalistic that that is what is needed. You go out, you do your research, you do your homework, and then from that, you're able to actualize that this means that the sanction that I'm heading in the right direction. The next is collaboration. Work needs to take place not in a vacuum, but in a collaborative setting where people aren't recreating the historical context of making decisions on behalf of others, but the empowering approach is taken where I become a consultant in my own welfare, because who knows better what's good for me or what will be best for me than me. Also, recognizing that it's not a one size fits all. It's taking a tailored approach, and the only way that it can be tailored is by collaborating. And collaboration, in essence, means more Blacks, more Indigenous, more people of color being involved in leadership and management. And it doesn't mean leadership where it is done, where you insert this person in a leadership position because we want to meet a diversity quota. No, we want it to be purposeful. We want it to be intentional, because the focus is to ensure that our actions and our policies are sustainable and are focused. And finally, funding. And as I spoke and as I prepared my slide and I thought about funding, it always takes me back to when I worked with nonprofit organization with First Nation individuals. And for the life of one of the clients that I had, I would always take her back to home visits, her reserve in North Battleford, Sweetgrass Reserve, and another reserve a little further. But it doesn't matter how far I would drive. It doesn't matter where I would go. Once I'm on those roads, the roads would be paved, they would be beautiful. And the moment I transitioned to enter on First Nation Reserve, it was like day and night. And the first time that realization dawned on me, on someone who sees Canada as a first world country, when I entered the reserve, I was like, what is happening here? The conditions on the reserve were worse than conditions that I, as an individual who grew up in a third world country, could have ever fathomed. And it was a rude awakening for me, the stark disparity in Canada as it relates to racialized groups and mainstream groups. And so when I say funding, I really mean funding where it's purposeful, funding where it's not. I was driving in Toronto and I was driving past a Catholic school, and the Catholic school on one side, it was glorious. The school was just beauty to the eyes, a feast that my eyes had. And right across the street was a public school, and it was day and night. And I thought and imagined all the children who had to sit across at that school and look over at the Catholic school and wondered what life would be there. And that's the whole intent. If we're creating a more inclusive society, if we're creating a more egalitarian society, if Canada is really true to its calls on multiculturalism, then we have to ensure that funding is focused in a more inclusive way, where no one is seen as more privileged or more important than the other. So that is it for me today on race-based trauma and benevolence clothed in racism. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Latoya. The one bad thing about these Zoom rooms is that I can't run and give you a hug and thank you for those inspiring words. But I'm going to pass it over now to Amal, who's going to talk a little bit from the perspective of someone from the Muslim community.